Welcome to the latest video as part of the GCSE History series from Pearson in collaboration with Harris Federation. This video is focused on Paper 2, the Period Study. So, who are we and what are we doing here? My name's Katie Matthews. I work as a Deputy Lead History Consultant for Harris Federation.
I'm Ben Armstrong. I'm a subject specialist working with Pearson Edexcel, and I specialise in GCSE History.
What are we planning to cover today then? Well, our aim is to have a look at what Paper 2 looks like, what the top tips are for this period study, how we're going to answer the questions most effectively in the examination, and some general tips to help you with your revision during your history GCSEs. So then, what does Paper 2 look like, Ben?
Paper 2 consists of two booklets, the Period Study and the British Depth Study. They're both sat at the same time as part of Paper 2. Together, the exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes long and worth 64 marks. Overall, Paper 2 is worth 40% of your GCSE, with each of the two booklets being worth 20% individually. It's worth noting that the Period Study and the British Depth Study are both worth 32 marks, so that means that in terms of dividing your time, you'll need to give them approximately half of the time. Since the invigilator isn't allowed to tell you which order to answer these booklets in, neither is the invigilator allowed to tell you when you should stop writing one and start writing the other. You'll need to keep an eye on the time for yourself. So what is the Period Study? Well, the Period Study involves examining historical events in a specific time frame. This paper is all about how developments or a sequence of events are connected to create an overall narrative of the period. When you get into the exam, your desk might look something like this. That seems a lot on the desk. What is it? Well, there you have two separate booklets. One is the British Depth Study and one is the Period Study. You also have a cover sheet which has some instructions on it to explain how you need to approach the exam. It's up to you, as we already said, which way round you answer them and how you divide your time, though we do recommend you divide your time evenly. How would you know which topics you're studying? Well, this will be the topic that your teacher has taught you for the period study. There are 5 options for the period studies, and you'll have learned one of these. We have Spain and the New World, we have British America, the American West, superpower relations and the Cold War, and conflict in the Middle East. You'll be given the booklet for whichever one you've studied.
Let's have a look at some top tips then for how you can prepare for your period study. Now, the first really important document that we recommend that you have a look at is called the specification. We've mentioned this in the other videos, but if you're still unfamiliar with what it is or where it is, do speak to your teacher or you'll be able to find it on the Pearson website. This one here is an example of one from the superpower relations unit. What you can see highlighted is some of the different content that you really need to know about before you get to the exam. Also, you need to be aware of the chronology of your unit. Now, each of the topics is divided into 3 separate key topics: key topic 1, key topic 2, and key topic 3. You can see on the screen here, we've shown you superpower relations in the Cold War and the American West. And how these differ to, say, the British Depth Study is that these 3 key topics all work chronologically, so they're never covering the same historical period. What you can see, though, is that they immediately follow one after the other.
Really important skill for getting ready for this exam is the concept of consequences. You really do need to have firmly in mind the idea of consequences as you're preparing for this paper. So what is a consequence? Well, it means the results or the outcomes of an event or a development. Take a look at this example. Here the student says, I revised well for the test in my history class. Well, what would be the consequences or the results of that student revising well for a test? As a result, one consequence might be that they later say, I didn't feel anxious. Well, that's logical. They would have been ready for the test. They might also say, I got a good mark. That's a consequence because they were prepared for the test. Of course, sometimes consequences could have further consequences. The student was ready for the test in the history class and so didn't feel anxious and got a good mark. And so a further consequence would be that they might feel more confident in the summer exam. In other words, consequences are the results or the outcomes of an event or development. So in terms of our history content, we need to know what happened next in the story, but also why it happened. You see, a consequence is more than just knowing what happened next. You've got to be able to explain how the consequence is linked to the development or the event. We'll talk about that a little later when we look at the questions. One other really important point. Remember, consequences can be good or bad. Some students make the mistake of thinking that consequences are always bad, and then they can get stuck. For example, maybe you've learned about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis, many of them were positive, improving relationships between the East and West. Some students, thinking that they can only talk about negative consequences, might not think of things that they need to talk about in the question.
And that's really useful because consequences is going to be something that we keep coming back to throughout this video.
Absolutely.
Right, let's have a look then at what the questions actually look like on this paper, because they're slightly different to some of the other papers that we've already explored and quite unique to this paper. So we've got 3 different question types on this paper. You can see here under question description, the first one is 2 consequences. So it will always begin explain 2 consequences of something or an event, and that's worth 8 marks. Then we've got the narrative question, which is write a narrative account analysing something. And then the importance question. So explain 2 of the following. And here, this is where you have your choice on the paper. You'll be given 3 different options of which you need to select 2. Now, really usefully, you'll see that each of the questions on this paper is worth 8 marks. And that's really to help you divide your time more effectively through this paper. So if you're on regular time, that's roughly 12 minutes per question. And if you've got extra time, that's 15 minutes per question. Now, as Ben's already said, consequence is really important throughout this paper. And that's because all 3 of these different question types are really connected to that concept of consequence. So should we dive in and have a look at question number 1 then, Ben, the explain 2 consequences one?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So what's question 1 about? Well, question 1 will always start, explain 2 consequences of, and then it will name an event or a development from the topic, something you've learned about and revised. So to explain a consequence, you need to first of all identify what the consequence was, but then you need to explain how it was connected to the event or the development in the question. If you only say what the consequence was, you won't be able to achieve full marks. The examiner's looking for 2 different things. First of all, the examiner's looking for features of the period that are analysed to explain the consequence. And they're also looking for specific information that is used to support the explanation, so that you can show good knowledge and understanding of the topic. Now, just one reminder on this question. It asks for 2 consequences, and it's really important that you give 2 different consequences, not the same consequence twice, because if you give the same consequence twice, you won't be awarded the marks for both consequences.
So how's the question laid out on the paper then, Ben?
So this is what the answer space will look like. And I think this is great because when you open the paper, it's going to help you to structure your answer, because it says underneath the question, consequence 1 with a space, consequence 2. So it's a great reminder that you need to cover 2 consequences, and it will also help you to avoid writing too much and running out of time later on in the paper. Just a note, we have cut a few lines out of this on the screen. It wouldn't all fit on the screen, so there are a few extra lines on the actual exam paper, but it's not a lot longer than you can see on the screen right now. Now let's take a look at what an answer might look like. So here is a past question. Explain 2 consequences of Gorbachev's new thinking. So this is from the superpower relations option. If that's not your option, don't worry. You can still see how this example is talking about consequences. And if you look, you'll notice we've just got the first consequence here. We're going to focus our attention on that. But obviously, to get a good mark, this student also had to write a second consequence. I suggest you pause the video here and take a moment to read the answer. So we've marked in red and blue some of the features of the answer. In red, we've marked the skill AO2. That's the analytical explanation. In other words, how this student explained the consequence analytically. Then we've also marked in blue AO1. Just like on the other papers, AO1 means knowledge and understanding, what knowledge the student has used to support their explanation. So let's look at the red first of all. This student has reached level 2, the highest level, because they've shown a clear connection between the new thinking and how it led to the end of aggressive conflicts. For example, the first underlined red section says, it led to the end of the Soviet war in Afghanistan in 1988. And then it says there is a clear connection between new thinking and the end of aggressive conflicts. So this student is identifying the analytical consequence. They've also got level 2, the highest level on this question, for their knowledge. They've identified how Gorbachev wanted to make communism better. They've identified how his policy led to withdrawing all soldiers from Afghanistan. It identifies 9 years, and it also has the date, 1988. There's plenty of examples of knowledge being used to support this explanation. As a result, this is 4 out of 4. If they'd performed on the same way on the second consequence to the same standard, then this would be a full mark answer.
I think that's really nice there, that you can really clearly see how this student has focused on consequence. Even that opening phrase, kind of one consequence of Gorbachev's new thinking, they go straight into it, making it really clear to the examiner. And they've used the space really nicely. I think sometimes students can just use the first few lines that are available, so they're more describing the consequence rather than explaining it. So using those lines as a guide is a really useful tip.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Katie. I completely agree. And the other thing I like about this answer is they've gone straight into the consequence. Some students fall into the trap of writing a few lines to say what the new thinking was. But the question isn't asking what his new thinking was, it's asking what the consequences were. So they've focused on the question. That's a really good example. Let's take a look at a different example. This one's from the American West option. You'll see the question looks the same in terms of its structure. Starts with explain 2 consequences, but this time it says of the Homestead Act 1862. Just like before, we're only showing you the first consequence. They had to also write a second consequence. We're just going to look at the one to focus on the skills. Another little point that I really like about this one is there's a tiny little plan in the top right corner. So I can immediately see that this student, before they started writing, took a moment just to think about what they were going to use as their answer. I suggest you pause the video now, have a read, and then we'll show you why it scored well. So let's look through the answer now you've had a chance to read it. Again, we've marked in red and blue. Red shows the analytical explanation, so explaining the link of the consequence to the Homestead Act, and blue is the knowledge that they have brought in to support their explanation of the consequence. So AO2, well, that's also reached level 2, the highest level, because they've explained and analysed the features really well, especially in the last line, which says the consequence to the Homestead Act meant that homesteaders were more likely to be able to develop the land and become successful. And earlier in the answer, they've talked about how geographical conditions on the land and harsh weather in the environment, as a consequence, farmers had to develop new techniques. So they are focusing on consequences of farmers using the Homestead Act to go out and settle in the American West. For AO1, their knowledge and understanding, well, there's several different examples of knowledge being used right from the beginning. They talk about the land that settlers were able to claim, 160 acres and $10. Then later on, it gives an example of one of the new techniques they've mentioned, dry farming. And then it also adds some knowledge of the red turkey variant and why that was a useful development, because it required a little amount of water. So they've not written an essay all about the Homestead Act, but what they have done is they've used some key points of knowledge to support their analysis of consequences. This is a really good example of a strong response.
And there are some nice similarities there between the first example of some of the language that's used. I've just jotted down things like due to, this meant that, consequently, all really nice phrases to use to show your use of AO2 as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Up next, then we've got question number 2. So should we have a look at what an analytical narrative account actually is? I think it's definitely one of my favourite questions on the papers.
Yeah, of course. It's a great question, isn't it? So this question is our narrative analysis. It says write a narrative account analysing, and then it gives us a topic from the course. In this case, the key events of the Berlin crisis. The first thing to highlight is that the question will always start with that phrase marked in orange, write a narrative account analysing. And that's always going to be the focus of question 2. Then we have the bit underlined in green. This is the topic that you're going to be asked to explain a narrative account for. You need to focus very carefully on what the account's about and what the dates are. In this case, 1948 to 49. Making sure you stick to those dates is very important. Then, underneath, circled in purple, like many of the other questions on your GCSE history papers, we have the 2 stimulus points, or the bullet points that are there to support you. Just like the stimulus points on all of the exam papers, which we've mentioned in some of the other videos, they're designed to help you to access the question. They don't have to be things that are named in the spec, but there'll be things that an examiner thinks might well help you to be able to engage with the question. Of course, you're not required to use them. Just above the bullet points, it says you may use the following in your answer. However, generally, students find that these are really helpful in approaching the breadth of the narrative. Generally speaking, these 2 bullet points will give some sense of narrative scope across the question, so they'll help you to start to construct your time frame that you're going to explain a narrative for. However, remember that whether or not you choose to use them, higher scoring answers need to cover 3 aspects of content. So whether or not you use those, you are going to have to cover a 3rd aspect of content if you're wanting to score a high mark. But really the key question is, what is an analytical narrative? What is this exam question really getting at? We'll take a look at this example, which is definitely not a history example. Here we have a narrative, or in other words, a story. It's a sequence of events. Starts with, I forgot to set my alarm. Then I overslept. Then we have, I was late for school. And then we had, I had to rush to first lesson. This is a series of events that are in the correct order, but it's not an analytical narrative. What's missing? Well, even though we have the events in the right order, there's no analytical links between the events. Let's look what that might look like if we turned it into an analytical narrative. So we start with the same order of events. We haven't changed them because they were in the right order. I forgot to set my alarm, which meant that it did not go off in the morning. As a result, I overslept. Can you see there how those first two steps have now been linked together? We can see how one led to the other. Well, we can carry that down the chain of events. This meant that I didn't have time to get ready, so I missed the bus. The consequence was that I was late for school. So now we can see how the oversleeping has led to this person being late for school. And then finally, we can link our last two events by saying, because of this, I'd already missed first bell, but I didn't want to be in trouble, so I had to rush to first lesson. Can you see how we've still got the same sequence of events and we haven't changed the order, but now we've shown how they connect to each other? And that clear language, for example, we've got as a result, this meant, the consequence was, because of this. And that's the sort of language that we can actually take, not just for this example, but into some of our history examples. We've linked the events together, so it's now an analytical narrative.
That's a really nice example, Ben. I think students will really relate to that, probably, I'm sure. Do you have an example that we could have a look at from a past history paper, though?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's an example. This is from the superpower relations paper. You can see the question's been laid out the same way. Write a narrative account analyzing US-Soviet relations in the years 1945 to 47. So here, students were asked to write a narrative of how US-Soviet relations had developed, and it's got a clear time period, 1945 to 47. So we're talking about a very specific time frame. And then to help out, there's a couple of bullet points that would be quite useful, actually. The Yalta Conference, well, that's useful because it's at the start of the period, and then Cominform, which comes in just at the end. So actually, those two bullet points would be really useful in constructing an idea of what the time frame is for the narrative. Here's an example of an answer from that exam paper. It's actually not the full answer, but we can get the point by just focusing on the first about 2/3. The rest of the section would have gone on to the next page, and we're not going to look at that in this video. I suggest you pause it, and then when you've had chance, carry the video on and we'll analyse this answer. So now you've had chance to read this answer, let's take a look at why it's a really good example. Once again, we've marked out with red and blue some of the key areas. The first thing we want to point out is that this response, it actually has a really clear beginning, middle, and end. Some of the end has actually gone off into the bit of the answer we're not going to look at. But if you look at the start, we begin with a clear starting point to our narrative. Firstly, relations started positive, and then it goes on to develop the answer. And that's a really good way of structuring this answer, thinking about what's our beginning of our story, what's the middle, and what's the end. Let's take a look at the red. In the red, we've got the analytical explanation. This is where the student has built our links for us through the story. And the language they've used is quite straightforward, but it's effective. For example, they say, this meant they had. This led to. The arms race began after. It was compounded. I like that one. It was compounded. That's good language. It highlighted anxieties. it also highlighted, and this led to. Of course, you can't just throw those phrases in and expect a high mark. You've got to know what you're linking and they've got to make sense. But that language is really showing that this student is trying to connect everything together. They've also given us some good supporting knowledge underlined in blue. They've identified the positive relations with the Yalta Conference. They mention the US using the atomic bomb. They refer to the Long and Novikov telegrams, and they refer to the Truman Doctrine and Cominform. Now, I think one thing that stands out to me on this answer is not that it's absolutely overwhelmed with knowledge. There's actually a reasonable amount of knowledge in there. It's not about the amount of knowledge you use so much as how well you use the knowledge to support your narrative. So it's better to select some key examples, key words, key dates, and so on, and use that to support your narrative than to simply write everything you know about the topic.
I would totally agree there, Ben. And I think as well, it's so clear that this student has taken a moment to plan and think about their answer before they've begun, making sure that each of the events or developments are written in a chronological way so that they are in the correct order. Because just mixing them up can just ruin the narrative so easily. But this student's been really successful.
Exactly. What a great example. And of course, we said to get a high mark, you need to have those three aspects of content. And if you look through here, they've got the two, which are the bullet points, but also within the answer down towards the bottom, they're also talking about Truman Doctrine, which was an aspect that wasn't in the bullet points. So they've done that, and it carries on into the bit of the answer you've not been shown to make sure that they've got three areas. That's why this can get a high mark in level 3.
Let's move on to look at question 3 then. This is the importance question, and this is one that definitely students do struggle a little bit with. So could you talk us through what it looks like and how it's laid out on the paper to begin with?
Yeah, of course. So this is what it will look like when you get to this page of the exam. Could look a little bit intimidating when you first see it, but actually, when we break it down, it's quite manageable. So the first line says, explain 2 of the following. And that's identifying that out of the 3 options, you need to answer 2 of them. Underneath, we have the 3 separated by bullet points. They're in the purple in the middle of the screen. And these are the 3 options. They're all structured in a similar way. We'll look at that in a moment, but they all start with the importance of something. Now, each of those options is worth 8 marks. But remember, you're only answering 2 of them, not 3 of them. So overall, this question is worth 16 marks. It's worth making sure you divide your time well. You might remember earlier Katie said that if you're on normal time, you've got about 12 minutes per question or 15 minutes per question if you're on extra time. So with this, you'd take 12 or 15 minutes, depending, for each of the 2 options that you choose. So let's just pay a bit of attention to one of our 3 options here. All of the options work the same way. So it starts with the importance of, because this question will always be about importance. That's the key concept that's being assessed. Then you'll have the topic the question's about, and that's here underlined in purple. Opening of the first transcontinental railroad, and then the years there, 1869, just to make sure you know what we're talking about. But then it will also always say for. For what? Well, it will tell you what you need to focus the importance on for a separate theme or group or topic. So here we have the opening of the first transcontinental railroad, its importance for the settlement of the West. And as we'll come back to in a moment, that's really important because it's impossible to score highly on this answer unless you focus on that last part of the question, what the topic is important for.
And I think that's a really easy trap that some students fall into. They just talk endlessly about the importance of an event without focusing on the second half. So that'd be really useful if you could talk us through some examples of how students could focus in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right with what you say. There's always some students who they just talk about importance generally. And generally speaking, if they do that, they'll be limited to level 2 marks. They won't get into level 3 if they're not focusing on that last bit of the question. So let's just talk about importance and why the last bit matters. Again, we're going to have a non-history example here. Let's just think about this for a moment. Imagine that in a local town centre, a supermarket that specialises in selling vegetarian food shuts down. Well, of course, there'd be consequences of that. If a shop shuts down, there's consequences. Some are more obvious than others. People who work there may lose their jobs. People who shop there might not be able to buy certain things. But of course, to think about why the shop shutting down is important, we really need to think about why those consequences matter. So there's two aspects to that. First of all, why is that consequence important? And also, who's it important for? Because it wouldn't be equally important depending what we were talking about. So take the example of this vegetarian supermarket that shuts down. Well, how might it affect these groups? Vegetarians in the town, non-vegetarian shoppers. What about people who work at the store? Or what about shoppers in other towns, not the town where the shop is? Just perhaps pause the video and just take a moment to think about how some of these groups might be affected by that shop shutting down. So different groups of people might not consider that event to have equal importance. For example, some groups might think, well, vegetarians in the town, if the vegetarian supermarket shut down, well, that might have more consequences for them as for people who work at the store. Why would it be important for them? Well, that might affect the ability of the customers to be able to buy the products that they want. That might affect their diet. Maybe they have to travel further to shop. The people who lose their jobs at the store, well, that's going to affect their families and their standard of living and so on. Whereas people who were less involved, well, it might be less important for them. If they were non-vegetarian shoppers, maybe they were going to other shops anyway, or shoppers in other towns were probably going to other shops. In other words, the idea we're getting across here is if we want to think about how important an event is, we really need to think important for what? It has to be important for something. And that's what this question's getting at. So let's go back to our history. Here's we've got our example, the importance of Gorbachev's new thinking for Soviet control of Eastern Europe. If a student just talked about Gorbachev's new thinking in general terms, well, that wouldn't score very highly because they need to say why was it important for Soviet control of Eastern Europe. So they might talk about how the new thinking was important because it weakened Soviet control of Eastern Europe. They might think about how it led to independence movements in some of those satellite states and how it started a movement for countries starting to break away from Soviet control. And they might talk about why that was important as a changing point. But what if we change the last bit of the question? What about if instead of Soviet control of Eastern Europe, instead we asked the importance of Gorbachev's new thinking for relations between East and West? Well, now it's not really relevant to talk about what's happening in those countries in Eastern Europe, because we're actually asking why was it important for the way the two superpowers related to each other? Or if we asked about its importance for US attitudes to the USSR, we're not really thinking about the relationship now. We're thinking, how does the US feel about the Soviet Union? How has this event been important? And importance could be positive, it could be negative. Equally, you could argue that something wasn't that important. That's also valid as long as you can explain it and support your answer.
I think that's a really useful point there to really pull out the kind of two parts of the question. And like you've rightly done, as soon as you change that kind of second part of it, ultimately that shows that you need to include the right content that's going to discuss kind of importance there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about focusing on that last bit of the question. And I'm going to show you that in a couple of examples, if that's all right, because I think that's really going to hammer the point home here. So let's take a look at this question. So we're going to use the top of the options from this question. The importance of the Marshall Plan 1947 for relations between East and West. So maybe you've revised about the Marshall Plan. If you're doing superpower relations, you might know all about this. But we're not interested in what the Marshall Plan did for countries that got money. We're not really interested in what was going on in America. We're talking about why was it important for the relationship between the superpowers East and West. So let's take a look at an example of an answer. Here's your answer, and I suggest you just pause it for a moment, give yourself a chance to read it, and then we'll analyse the answer in a moment. So if you had a chance to read it, let's just take a look. Once again, we've got our red, which is our analytical explanation, and we've got blue, which is the knowledge and understanding. So this answer is really focused on the importance of the Marshall Plan for relations between East and West. And so it has some clear language showing why it was important. For example, the first underlined red bit says, because it further divided Eastern and Western Europe. Later on, it said, this led to a greater division. And it says, as such, the East and West became more polarized. So it's focused on why this development, the Marshall Plan, was important. Why did it make a difference to the relationship between East and West? It's also got plenty of knowledge in there, underlined in blue. They've got that the Marshall Plan gave war-torn countries money to stop them falling in communism. It mentions it was given to Western non-communist countries. And then it mentions about the contrast between living standards under non-communists and the living standards under communism, which changed. And then there's a key phrase, Stalin criticized it as dollar imperialism. So plenty of examples of key knowledge being used to support this answer. Now, do you remember we said it has to link to that last bit of the question? And I just want to prove to you how well this answer is linked. So I've just highlighted the same answer this way. So while the last bit of the question said relations between East and West, and I've highlighted all the times when it links back to that bit of the question. And I think it's amazing just how much is highlighted. So it says, for relations between East and West, it divided Eastern and Western Europe. Then it talks about Western non-communist countries and Eastern European countries, Western living standards, Eastern living standards, East and West became more polarized. All the way through that answer, it's focused on the relations between East and West and why the Marshall Plan was important.
That's a really clear. Give me more marks, examiner. I think this student's done a really good job at this. Yeah, I can see that perfectly. Have you got another example that you could show us on importance as well, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take this one from the American West and we'll see another example. This one's not quite as strong, but it does show a good way of answering the question. So this is the importance of the Exodus to movement 1879 for the growth of settlement. And once again, remember, it's not just how important was the Exodus to movement generally, how important was it for the growth of settlement? Pause the video, and then when you've had a read, we'll unpause the video and we'll go and analyze the answer. So we've got our red and blue underlining. Let's focus on the red first of all. This is a high level in AO2, the red, it's level 3, which is the top level on this question. And they've focused quite clearly on the importance of the Exodus to movement for the growth of settlement. Near the top, it says it was very important for settlement. It's a good way to start the line. Further down, it says then, as many slaves moved north, they impacted jobs and living areas. Towns were much more diverse. The economy grew as well. There were many more workers doing jobs, mainly on farms. So it is focusing on settlement and how it made a difference. Further down, it then says there was a mass migration north to Kansas, and it largely increased northern settlement. Now, this candidate's actually done two different ways it was important. This question doesn't require a certain number of ways. Some students will do it like this, where they have a couple of different ways it's important. Some will write one large reason why it's important, and they'll focus on it with one main area. There's no particular requirement for how many different points you have to make on here. Now, with the knowledge, I don't know if you can spot immediately a difference between this one and the previous one. They have got some knowledge in there, but it's a little thinner than the last one we saw. The last one had quite a few examples of blue underlining. This one's just a little bit thinner on it. It does mention about slavery in the South being abolished. It mentions an example of a state, Kansas, and it talks about the fact people were looking for where there was plenty of land and little racism. But beyond that, it's a little bit limited on the actual knowledge. And so one thing that let this answer down was that whilst it was very good at explaining the importance, it could have been improved by having just a little more precise knowledge being selected to support the answer. So this didn't get full marks, it actually got a low level 3, and it could have been a higher one with just a few more examples included in.
Really useful to have a look at the kind of variation there in level 3 between kind of a 6 out of 8, 7, 8 out of 8. So really useful. Thank you, Ben. Should we move now to having a look more generally about how we can revise for this period study? I think what is also useful to note before we kind of move on to this is just thinking about this paper as a whole. And as Ben said at the beginning, you have to divide up your time yourself between the two booklets, so your British paper and your period study. And sometimes what that can mean is poor management of time might lead to blank answers on this paper. Now, always we would suggest that you give the paper a go. It's much better to write something rather than to write nothing. So do your best to try not to leave any blank questions on this paper. Let's have a look then about how we can revise for this period study. So going back to the document which I mentioned at the beginning, which is the specification, this is always my go-to document for what content you really need to know for the examination. So, for example, here I've highlighted some of the things that you might want to be revising, but generally you want to make sure you read through each of those bullet points to make sure you're familiar and comfortable with the content. Then what you could do is turn that into a flashcard. So, for example, here, the creation of NATO. You can use symbols or images to help you kind of remember, and that's a really useful revision tip. It doesn't always have to be writing, you can get more creative. And then on the other side, you might want to add some content to it or write yourself some questions and use somebody at home to maybe kind of test you or help you revise. Ben, is there anything you want to add there?
So it's just on the flashcard, actually. I don't know if you can just see it on the screen, but the bullet points on the right for what would be on the back of the card, there's a little bit of information. There's the year that NATO's from, and there's what NATO was. But then half of the card is actually what were the consequences. And that's a useful way of revising if you're going to make flashcards and notes. You see, when you're doing your British depth study and your history environment and the other parts of your GCSE history, you might want a wider kind of range of knowledge in terms of causes of things and what it was and who was involved. But really on this paper, we've already said consequences is at the core of some of these questions. So if you are going to make notes, it's really good idea to make sure you've prioritized what were the consequences, because that's going to really help you to have the right knowledge to focus on the exam questions.
Definitely. And building on that, I think getting events in the right order is really, really important.
Absolutely.
So a good old classic revision technique up next is a history teacher's favourite, which is the timeline. Again, going back to that specification document, anything with a date, really kind of plotting it out and making sure you've got things in the correct order. What that will also help you do is see where events overlap and where things are happening at the same time, because there can be periods of kind of crisis, for example, in the superpower relations course, where there's lots of things going on at the same time in the end of the 50s and the early 60s. So really useful to kind of map it out. What that also helps you do in terms of your examination kind of skills is learn, well, what happens next? And that's really a useful way to think about consequences as well. And then thinking more generally about some of the patterns that come out of the period study. And as Ben said earlier, that importance, well, why did it matter? Why did it matter that the atomic bomb dropped? Well, generally you'll know for that early period that there is an increase in tensions, and you could argue that that was the importance of the atomic bomb in that sense. So a really useful revision tip there. Another idea is looking at some of the past exam questions. There's lots of past papers that are available on the Pearson website for you, or your teacher will be able to help you with them, I am sure. But you could have a go, as Ben did with that 8-mark question on importance, about playing with the two parts of the question. So you might want to swap what's there for a different stem. So for example, changing it to relations between East and West, or the Soviet control of Eastern Europe, or superpower relations more generally, and just making sure then that how that's going to impact the way that you're writing. So you might want to practice the exam question using those different question stems in multiple different ways. The other thing to point out would be the date range. And in all of those example questions we looked at, obviously the date really matters. If you're talking about things that are outside of the range of the question, you're simply not going to get the marks. So again, going back to the timeline idea for revision, that's really useful to know the kind of cut-off points for events and developments happening. But you also might want to play around with the date ranges within, say, the narrative question. Increasing or decreasing, to kind of think about how deep your knowledge is and how precise you can get your answers. Another useful revision idea is to play a game of what if. We like this as history teachers, but what if this hadn't happened? And that's really useful to start to think more advancedly about importance. Well, what if the US hadn't dropped the atom bomb at the end of World War II? What would have happened? Would the Cold War have started when it did? Would it have started at all? And that's a really useful way then for you to really be much more confident in your arguments. And so that's a really useful one to go through the specification again and pick out some of these key events and developments and ask that really pointed question. Then another one, a similar kind of timeline, but a slightly different approach. Again, taking the specification and thinking about, particularly for the superpower relations course, how tensions change over time. And that's really useful for understanding the general patterns. So for example, here I've mapped across kind of the difference between superpower relations being good or bad in the 1940s, and then how that changes into the 1950s. Obviously, I've written this probably about 3 or 4 times, changed my mind and gone, actually, I think that one's a little bit higher than that one. No, I'll start again. But it's a really useful way to revise and really kind of refine your knowledge. And then you can start to label it up with what you consider some of the key turning points to be. And then again, that goes back to that importance. Well, for me, in this period, the atom bomb, the Berlin crisis, the death of Stalin, the Hungarian uprising are all really important things that happen that I think really impact superpower relations. But just a few different ideas. Your teacher will have plenty more for you, I'm sure. But definitely practice. Lots of exam question practice. Us as teachers, and I'll speak on behalf of us all, we wish you did more and bring us more questions to mark. But yeah, would really recommend that. And that brings us to the end of this video on paper 2, the period study. We hope that you found it useful and that understanding the exam technique and the paper has been really helpful. But we wish you the best of luck in your exams in the summer and hope you follow on by watching the rest of the videos in this series.